Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for January 23rd, 2023. Well, last week was a week of very significant events. I'm going to focus on two of them in particular, both of which I would say were failures for the NATO alliance. One being the Davos conference, where you saw a bunch of delusional oligarchs get together assuming they could impose their vision on the entire world, when in fact there's a significant growth of disunion within their ranks, especially as their whole project seems to be collapsing. The whole World Economic Forum project and the global reset, the Green New Deal, seems to be disintegrating in front of their eyes. And at the same time, there was the Ukraine contact group meeting in Ramstein Air Base in Germany, which was a failure in that they failed to get the agreement from Germany to send tanks to Ukraine, which was part of the front end of a continued escalation of that war. Doesn't mean they're not going to continue to escalate, but that the pressure on Germany will continue. But this is a blow to the intention of the war hawks behind the war. Now, at the same time, you have the debt crises, which is affecting virtually all advanced sector countries as well as the global south. You have inflation. You have a Russian offensive, which is beginning to get some traction. And you have political troubles in Kiev. So let's start with the delusional lunatics. Whenever you talk about delusional lunatics, one of the first people comes to mind is Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, a Republican. He was in Kiev with Democratic war hawks Richard Blumenthal and Sheldon Whitehouse, both of whom were Democrats. Graham said of their discussions, "Ukraine needs tanks. I'm tired of the shit show surrounding tanks. World order is at stake," unquote, said the hapless idiot Lindsey Graham. At the same time, there was a delegation of U.S. military officials in Kharkov, and they said the common belief is that Ukraine can only drive the Russians out if they have, quote, enough advanced heavy weapons, unquote. Well, this is the continuing plea from Zelensky's regime, from Stoltenberg of NATO, from the British war hawks, and from the Biden administration. More weapons, even as they're running out of weapons, and even as they're saying the Russians are running out of weapons. Now, there's an interesting comment in military.com by an active duty U.S. Air Defense System officer who had an op-ed who wrote that sending Patriot batteries to Ukraine will turn out to be, quote, an expensive blunder, unquote. His name is Geoff Lamar, and he concurred with the previous assessments from experts such as Colonel Douglas Macgregor and Scott Ritter, that the Patriot system is not going to work very well in the Ukraine situation. Lamar wrote that the Patriot's capability against drones is as likely to succeed as, quote, water balloons to stop a forest fire, unquote. Keep in mind, the Patriot costs $4 million per round and $10 million each for the launchers, but the battery as a whole costs over $1 billion. And you're talking about sending 10 Patriot batteries to Ukraine. It's $400 million for the system and $690 million for the missiles for each battery. Now, this is why people around the world are increasingly skeptical about U.S. NATO military leadership. One of those is Michele Geraci, a former member of the Italian government, who said, quote, "We have a serious delusion problem, a persistent, false, psychotic belief that is being kept despite indisputable evidence of the contrary." Now, this is on display with someone such as Boris Johnson, who said Ukraine will get all the weapons and equipment it needs to win. And one of the more extreme examples of this spoke at Davos. Chrystia Freeland, who's Canada's finance minister and deputy prime minister. And she connects the war enthusiasm with economic policy. And here's what she said. We can't control COVID. We don't control global supply chain issues or inflation, but we can help Ukraine win the war. And she said, if we do, there will, quote, be a huge boost to the global economy. In other words, going with a full-scale military buildup is now the solution being put forward by militant warhawks such as Freeland. Now, her background tells you a lot about her. She was a writer on economics for the Financial Times, for the Toronto Globe and Mail, for Reuters, but she's a hardcore supporter of the Kiev regime. She's of Ukrainian descent. She denies that there are neo-Nazis in the military and defense sector and says that Putin must be stopped. Now, what she doesn't tell you, and what she's done everything she can to cover up, is that her maternal grandfather, Michael Chomiak, was the chief editor of a Ukrainian newspaper during World War II, working directly for the Nazis. This paper was sponsored by the Nazis. It supported massacres against Jews and others. The Freeland claimed that the charges against her grandfather, that he was pro-Nazi, were, quote, Russian disinformation. Sound familiar? But the Toronto Globe and Mail reported that she knew her grandfather's Nazi connections. In a March 2017 article, the Toronto Globe and Mail wrote that she knew her father was an editor of a Nazi newspaper. She even helped edit an article by her uncle, which revealed that he was a Nazi propagandist when he was editor of the Krakow News. Now, his direct superior, that is Chomiak's direct superior, was Emil Gassner, who is an assistant to Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister. Gassner and the Nazis used Chomiak's paper to run anti-Semitic articles, including some that coincided with the uprising of Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto against the Nazi murderous policies, and that these editorials were used to build support in the population for massacres against Jews in Ukraine and that general area. Now, despite her efforts to cover up her grandfather's role, saying he really didn't support this, no evidence exists to show that he either opposed this or that he was compelled to do so. So here we have an interesting point. War is good for the economy, and supporting Nazis is good for humanity if it's against Russia. That's Chrystia Freeland. Now, why is this important? Not just because she's the Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister of Canada. She is being mooted as the replacement for Jens Stoltenberg when his term runs out as NATO General Secretary. So a Nazi supporter, defender of a editorialist who editorialized for pogroms and who defends him, is in line to be the NATO General Secretary. And you wonder why the Russians have made such an issue out of the neo-Nazis in Ukraine. Well, that tells you a lot. Now, on the question of the failure at Ramstein, the German government refused to grant permission to Poland to sell its Leopard tanks to Ukraine. They're under enormous pressure to do so. Annalena Baerbock, the German foreign minister, disagrees with the Chancellor Scholz and is demanding that these tanks be delivered. I wonder if Scholz and people who are supporting him against delivering the tanks have in mind that we're coming up on the 80th anniversary of the defeat of the Nazis at Stalingrad. The Nazi army, the German army, had supply chain issues. They had a long distance to supply their forces. They had ample tanks when they started, but by the end, they were completely, the tanks were cut off. They had no fuel, they had no food, and it was a total defeat of the Nazis in February 1943. We're coming up on the 80th anniversary of that event. Now, in terms of chaos in Kiev, just one quick word on that. you have Arestovich, who was one of the leading advisors to Zelensky, who told the truth. He said that the Dnipro apartment attack was not targeted by a Russian missile, but hit by a missile that had been hit by Ukrainian anti-missile fire. And because of that, he was immediately attacked. He was put on a hit list. He resigned. He admitted he made a mistake by saying that. In other words, telling the truth is a mistake. But then he went further. He said that the Ukrainian government is behaving like assholes toward the people of Ukraine by lying, by not telling the truth. And it's interesting. What was his job as the advisor to Zelensky? To counter the spread of disinformation. So when he's doing his job, namely countering the spread of disinformation against the Russians, he not only loses his job, but he's put on a hit list. That's the nature of who we're supporting in Ukraine. And by we, I mean the NATO and US and British governments. Now, finally, I have a link at the bottom of the description page to a very interesting interview with Stephen Starr, a nuclear weapons expert, on the effect of nuclear war and how we're headed toward nuclear war unless we change the policy. And then I'm also connecting or linking a singing event where some of the LaRouche movement supporters intervene on a meeting of war hawk AOC, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, who continues to support the arms delivery and the money to Ukraine. So you'll see how we intervened on her with a beautiful singing intervention. So watch these two videos, and I'll see you again tomorrow.